He killed 17,000 people in just 1 year, without blinking. Maximilien Robespierre, once the voice of liberty, became the architect of death during the French Revolution. With the stroke of a pen, he turned suspicion into execution. Friend or foe, no one was safe, and in the end, the blade he praised came for him too. This is the true story of Robespierre's crimes and his terrifying fall. He was not born a killer. Maximilien Robespierre entered the world on May 6, 1758, in the quiet town of Arras, northern France. His father was a lawyer. His mother died when he was 6. The loss struck like a chisel to stone, leaving behind a boy too quiet, too serious, already learning that the world rewards silence more than it comforts grief. His father, shattered by the death of his wife, abandoned the family not long after. Robespierre was left with relatives and a memory of justice that never arrived. He grew up hungry for structure, hungry for order, hungry for a truth that wouldn't vanish like his parents did. At school he excelled, not just as a bright student, but as a moralist. He read Rousseau not as philosophy, but as prophecy. He devoured the idea that society was corrupt at its core, and only through radical change could it be cleansed, that the individual must be sacrificed for the greater good. Even as a teenager, he saw the world not in shades of grey, but in black and white, virtue and vice. He believed in purity, and that belief would one day justify the sound of falling heads. He was accepted to the Lycée Louis le Grand in Paris, once one of the most elite schools in France. There, Robespierre walked among the children of nobility, dressed in the same uniforms, reading the same books, but carrying inside him a serrure, colder than any royal courtroom. While others dreamed of wealth or titles, he dreamed of justice served by fate. One event left a mark so deep it would return like a ghost years later. When Robespierre, still a student, was chosen to deliver a welcome speech to none other than King Louis XVI, it rained. The king didn't get out of his carriage. He didn't even open the window. Robespierre stood in the downpour and recited his speech to an empty seat. That moment became a seed, small, bitter, and buried deep. Years later, that same king would not be in a carriage. He would be on a scaffold looking up at the blade. And Robespierre would not be standing in the rain. He would be giving the order. But for now, the boy from Arras returned home. He became a lawyer like his father, fighting for the poor in a town ruled by wealth. He defended widows, he challenged landowners. He denounced inequality with such precision that people began to call him incorruptible. Not popular, not warm, but incorruptible. And in 1789, when revolution began to boil across France, Robespierre stepped into the storm not as a soldier or a general, but as a man who believed he was the very conscience of the people. To some he was a voice of reason, to others a prophet. But no one could see yet that he would become something else entirely, a man who believed that in order to create a perfect society, he had to destroy everyone who wasn't perfect. That idea didn't start on the guillotine. It started here, in the silence of a neglected child, in the classroom of a broken kingdom, and in the unwavering belief that only he knew what was good. Robespierre was not born a monster. He became one, brick by brick, thought by thought, word by word, and the revolution, hungry for heroes, welcomed him with open arms. What they didn't realize was that he would never let go. In the bloodied summer of 1789, Paris was no longer a city. It was a furnace, bread was scarce, walls were covered in slogans, and power, the ancient inherited kind, was cracking like old marble under the weight of new voices. The Bastille fell. The king blinked, and into that chaos walked a man with a thin frame, a sharp tongue, and eyes that never laughed. Maximilien Robespierre. At first he spoke with restraint. In the National Assembly he was almost forgettable. He didn't shout, he didn't storm, but what he lacked in thunder, he made up for in purity. He refused bribes, he refused luxury, he refused compromise. To many he seemed unshakable, to others inhuman. He opposed the death penalty early on. He spoke of justice, of enlightenment, of lifting the people from chains, but behind his words lay something colder, a belief that virtue, once defined, must be enforced, not debated, and Robespierre would be the one to define it. The more extreme the revolution became, the more relevant he grew. While others stumbled between ideals and panic, he walked a straight line toward control. Not because he lusted for it, he claimed to despise power, but because he believed no one else was morally fit to wield it. By 1791, Robespierre had become a leading figure in the Jacobin Club, a political group that believed the revolution must go further. The king must fall. The old nobility must be erased. France must be reborn in the image of virtue. He began giving speeches that didn't argue, they judged. He didn't persuade the people. He condemned their enemies, and the people cheered. He wasn't charismatic in the way Danton was. He didn't charm like Desmoulins, but he had something more dangerous: certainty. In 1792, when the monarchy was officially abolished and Louis XVI stood trial, Robespierre was clear. No trial, he said. The king is guilty by his very existence. He wasn't calling for justice anymore. He was calling for purification. And when the king was executed by guillotine in January 1793, it wasn't just a head that fell. It was the final chain that bound France to mercy. Robespierre joined the Committee of Public Safety, a name that would soon ring with irony, and began reshaping the revolution in his own image. The guillotine became a tool of virtue. Arrest became a form of civic hygiene. Fear became patriotism. He declared, "Terror is nothing but prompt, severe, inflexible justice." Justice, defined by Robespierre. Laws were rewritten. Trials were shortened. Doubt became guilt. And Robespierre's voice, soft, deliberate, unwavering, became the voice of the revolution. Those who once sat beside him in the assembly now watched their backs. He spoke of love for the people, but people vanished in the night. He spoke of morality, but children saw their parents dragged to prison. Robespierre was not just gaining power. He was absorbing it, refining it, weaponizing it. By mid-1793, he was no longer a deputy. He was a judge, a priest, a shadow that loomed over Paris like a quiet storm. He did not smile. He did not drink. He did not sleep much. But his pen never stopped. Lists of names, accusations, decrees. He saw himself as a surgeon. The body of France was sick, infected with counter-revolutionaries, traitors and skeptics, and he would be the scalpel. What he didn't see was that the scalpel had no handle, and the blade was growing dull. The guillotine didn't appear overnight. Its shadow grew gradually, like a dark ink stain spreading across parchment, slow, silent, irreversible. The first time Maximilien Robespierre tasted blood, it wasn't from an enemy, it was from a friend. Georges Danton, fiery, beloved, larger than life, had once stood side by side with Robespierre. They toasted to revolution, argued in cafes, stood shoulder to shoulder in the assembly. But Danton changed. He grew weary of death. He began calling for moderation, for peace. The revolution is devouring its children, he warned. Robespierre didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He wrote. He compiled a file. And in April 1794, he sent Danton to the guillotine. The crowd screamed. Danton cursed him to his face. But Robespierre just looked down from the platform, hands clasped, silent as a priest. Danton was not the only one. Camille Desmoulins, Robespierre's childhood friend, the boy who once played with him in the gardens of Arras, who had introduced him to revolutionary politics, also hesitated. He begged for leniency, for mercy. He published a newspaper pleading for an end to the executions. Robespierre called him dangerous. Desmoulins' wife begged Robespierre in person. She wept on her knees. It didn't matter. Camille Desmoulins followed Danton to the scaffold. Two close friends, gone, and the guillotine didn't stop spinning. These were not accidents. These were messages. Robespierre had begun to define enemies not by their actions, but by their doubts. To question him was to question virtue, and to question virtue was treason. The reign of terror began its full descent. It wasn't just nobles or priests anymore. It was bakers, teachers, playwrights, seamstresses, farmers, servants, all suspected of anti-revolutionary thought, all paraded through kangaroo courts, all found guilty in minutes, and all condemned to die. The blade fell daily in Paris, sometimes over 40 heads in a single day. Blood ran into the gutters so thick that workers stuffed hay into the execution carts to keep it from dripping. But Robespierre did not blink. He walked past the Place de la Révolution like a man strolling through a garden. He gave speeches praising virtue while the blood dried behind him. In June 1794, he went further. He introduced the law of 22 prairial, a terrifying decree that stripped citizens of their rights to defence, evidence or appeal. Anyone accused of being an enemy of the people would be executed. No trial needed, no proof required. The law was passed, and within weeks, 400 people were guillotined. The prisons overflowed, the cemeteries bulged, the air smelled of iron and rot. People began to speak in whispers. Eyes lowered in the streets, for the most radical Jacobins trembled in the assembly. They had helped build the monster. Now it was feeding on them too. But Robespierre didn't see panic. He saw purification. He believed that every execution brought France closer to moral rebirth. He quoted Roman philosophers. He compared himself to Brutus. He gave speeches about light while standing knee-deep in shadow. Even as the terror spread, Robespierre insisted it was not cruelty. It was necessary surgery. The country, he said, was still sick. And he, the incorruptible doctor, still had work to do. By the summer of 1794, the revolution was no longer about freedom. It was about fear. Every day in Paris began with rumours. Who had disappeared? Who was accused? Who would face the guillotine before sunset? Every night ended with the sound of carts rumbling over cobblestones, carrying the condemned to their deaths. And at the centre of it all was one man, Maximilien Robespierre. He no longer spoke of democracy, he spoke of virtue and betrayal, of sacred duty and necessary blood. The revolution, he claimed, had reached its critical moment, and only through revolutionary terror could it be saved from enemies within. He had become judge, jury, and silent God. But Robespierre wasn't just executing traitors. He was redefining what it meant to be one. Say the wrong word? Death. Greet someone who had been accused? Death. Own a portrait of the king? Death. No one was too poor to be dangerous. No one was too close to be spared. Even the revolutionary government trembled. Deputies of the National Convention began showing up to work with goodbye letters in their pockets, unsure if today was the day they'd be named in one of Robespierre's lists. And those lists were real. He kept them hidden. He whispered them to allies. He read out names one by one, and each time a dozen more heads would roll. Then came the Festival of the Supreme Being, a public holiday Robespierre designed himself. He had outlawed Christianity, denounced atheism, and invented a new religion, the cult of the Supreme Being. It wasn't about God, it was about him. He climbed a man-made mountain in front of thousands, dressed in white, surrounded by trumpets and flowers. He gave a speech, arms outstretched like a messiah calling down fire. People clapped, but behind their applause was confusion and fear. Even his closest allies began to whisper, was Robespierre becoming a dictator, a lunatic, a divine executioner? The guillotine kept working. In June and July alone, over 1,000 people were killed in Paris. Many were executed the same day they were accused. Some were priests, some were children. Some were women who had simply mourned a lost husband or defended a neighbour. Whole neighbourhoods fell lientan. And still Robespierre stood unmoved. He called it justice. He said, citizens, the revolution is like a volcano. Only when it burns does it purify. But in truth there was nothing left to cleanse. He had already seared the press, already executed the moderates, already beheaded the radicals. What remained was tyrants, and that sudden silence was beginning to swallow him too. In the final weeks of the terror, Robespierre began isolating himself. He rarely appeared in the public. When he did, he seemed paranoid, shaking, haunted. He made speeches filled with vague threats, claiming, traitors surround us, but naming no names. He accused former allies. He hinted that more purges were coming. Everyone began to realize they might be next, and that realization was the beginning of his end. July 1794. France was bleeding from within. Every conversation was cautious, every eye suspicious. People stopped greeting each other in the streets. What if a nod was seen as loyalty to someone already condemned? Children whispered at the home. Mothers burned old letters. Men slept with their shoes on, ready to flee before dawn. And still, Robespierre spoke of virtue. But now he was no longer leading the revolution. He was circling it, haunted, hunted, unravelling. He began avoiding the Committee of Public Safety. Once its most commanding voice, he now skipped meetings, secluding himself with a shrinking circle of devoted allies. Saint-Just, Couthon, L'Abbaye. They called themselves the guardians of the revolution. Others called them the architects of death. Robespierre walked the halls of the Jacobin Club like a ghost in a temple built to worship only him. His speeches turned inward, long, cryptic, apocalyptic. On July 26th, he stood before the National Convention with a trembling hand and a sheet of accusations. He declared, I will name no one, but I have a list. A list of traitors, of enemies hiding within the government, but he refused to read it. That decision sealed his fate. The room froze. Everyone looked at everyone else. No one knew who was safe anymore. By not naming names, he condemned them all. Even those who had once supported him now saw it clearly. Robespierre would keep killing until only he remained. The next day, July 27th, the convention erupted. Deputies, once afraid to speak, rose one after another to denounce him. "Down with the tyrant! He threatens us all! He wants to be king!" Robespierre tried to respond, but the microphone was cut off, literally. They turned off his voice. Shouts drowned out his words. The chamber for once roared louder than he did. The convention voted quickly, unanimously, to arrest him. He stood stunned. It was the first time in years that power slipped from his hands. He was taken to prison, but even now chaos followed him. 5 prisons refused to hold him, some out of fear, others out of loyalty. His allies tried to organize a rescue. Paris teetered on the edge of civil war for one night. But something had changed. The people no longer feared Robespierre, they hated him, and that hate was stronger than any ideology he had used to justify blood. That evening, a small group of loyalists barricaded themselves in the Hôtel de Ville. Robespierre was with them, pale, silent, trembling. The man who had once commanded the revolution now sat slumped over a desk. Just after midnight, soldiers stormed the building. Shots rang out. Robespierre was found with a shattered jaw, either from a suicide attempt or a gunshot wound inflicted by one of the guards. The truth remains debated. He was carried out, bleeding, unable to speak, barely conscious. He would not be given a trial. He would not be allowed a defence, just like the thousands he had condemned. July 28th, 1702. Paris awoke to the news that Maximilien Robespierre had been arrested and wounded. Crowds gathered near the Hôtel de Ville, where just hours earlier the once feared architect of the Reign of Terror had been dragged out, his jaw hanging limp, his mouth unable to speak the words that once commanded a nation. The man who had sent thousands to their death was now broken, bloodied, and voiceless. Poetic justice, some whispered. Divine punishment, others said. He lay on a table in the hall of the Committee of Public Safety, eyes swollen, head bandaged, jaw held in place by dirty rags. The doctor refused to treat him. The guards refused to speak to him. He was no longer the incorruptible. He was a prisoner of history. As dawn rose, he was loaded onto a cart, the same cart used for Danton, for Desmoulins, for the 1,000 men and women he had watched perish beneath the guillotine. His hands were bound, his mouth still bled. He could not argue. He could not defend himself. He could not speak at all. The cart rolled through Paris slowly. People lined the streets, not with fear but with fury. They jeered, spat, threw mud. Some wept with relief. A woman screamed, "There is no God, but there is justice." It was the same path he had walked so many others down. Now it was his. At the Place de la Révolution the scaffold stood waiting. It had not been dismantled. It had not grown dull. In fact, it had been sharpened. One by one, Robespierre's closest allies were executed before him. Saint-Just, Couthon, Lebas. Their heads dropped into the basket while he watched, held upright by guards. Then came his turn. He was lifted from the cart, his bloodied bandages soaked and foul. As he climbed the stairs, half carried, half dragged, the crowd held its breath. No final words, no cries for mercy, just a muffled groan through the ruined jaw of a man who had once ruled France through speeches. He was laid down beneath the blade. At 6:30 in the evening the guillotine fell, and Maximilien Robespierre was no more. The crowd erupted, not with silence but with cheers, a wave of applause, laughter, even dancing. The city that had once trembled at the sound of his name now celebrated his death like a festival. His body, along with those of his allies, was thrown into a pit at the Arancis cemetery. No marker, no cross, no monument. The man who had preached virtue, who had claimed to purify a nation through terror, was now buried in anonymity, just another corpse in the soil he had soaked with blood. But the terror didn't vanish overnight. The scars remained. Wives waited for husbands who would never come home. Children grew up with names erased from family records. France had become a nation of whispers and ghosts. The reign of terror had ended. but at a cost no revolution could justify. Robespierre's fall was not just a collapse of one man, it was the death of an idea, that virtue can be enforced by violence, that a republic can be built on the silence of dissent, that morality when mixed with fear becomes something unrecognizable. In the end, his mouth was silenced by the very violence he had unleashed, and France would spend generations trying to forget him. The blade fell, and so did his name. No statues were erected, no tomb was honoured, no funeral was held. The man who had once stood at the summit of revolutionary France vanished into the pit of history like a discarded script, burned, buried and almost forgotten. Robespierre's body, like the bodies of his followers, was tossed into an unmarked grave at the Arancis cemetery. No monument marked the site, no plaque remembered the dates. His bones mingled with the remains of those he had sentenced. The revolution had devoured its prophet and then moved on. Within days of his death, the machinery of terror was dismantled. The law of 22 Prairial, the deadliest decree of the revolution, was repealed. The revolutionary tribunal was disbanded. The execution slowed, then stopped, and as the blood dried from the scaffold, so too began the quiet erasure of Maximilien Robespierre. The Jacobin Club, once his temple, was shut down. His writings were banned, his speeches were hidden from the public. Even his allies, those who had cheered beside him, now denied ever knowing him. In the months that followed, it became dangerous to speak his name with sympathy. France, a nation still shaking from its own heartbeat, wanted to believe that the terror had been the work of one man, that if Robespierre was dead, the nightmare had ended. It was easier that way, easier to bury guilt with the body. In Paris, walls that once bore his slogans were painted over. The Place de la Révolution was renamed. Artists who had painted his portraits now destroyed them. Street performers mocked him in grotesque caricatures, his jaw mangled, his robes torn. Children were taught to call him a monster. Even his enemies, who once feared him like a shadow on their door, now turned his memory into a cautionary tale. But history, though bruised, does not forget. In time, the erasure frayed at the edges. Whispers of complexity returned. He had been against slavery. He had defended the poor. He had once denounced the death penalty. Could it be, some wondered quietly, that Robespierre was not born evil, but was consumed by the very revolution he tried to save? Still, for decades, especially in the years after Napoleon's rise, Robespierre remained an unspoken scar. France had no appetite to examine him. He was a symbol too heavy, a mirror too clear. The word Robespierrist became an insult. His family home in Arras was boarded up, his name was kept off memorials, and unlike so many figures of the revolution, Mirabeau, Lafayette, Marat, Robespierre's grave was never found, because no one looked for it. Even today, the exact location of his remains is unknown. The Arancis cemetery was paved over during the expansion of Paris under Napoleon III. The bones were relocated to catacombs, without names, without records. Maximilien Robespierre, the man who once decided who would live and who would die, was now just dust among thousands, a ghost without a tomb, a voice swallowed by the silence he once imposed on others. But memory has its own rebellion, and while France tried to erase him, history would not fully. Because Robespierre is more than a man, he is a warning. The silence didn't last forever. As France crawled out of the shadow of the guillotine, and generations passed, something strange happened. People began to speak Robespierre's name again, not with reverence, not with hatred, but with curiosity. What had really happened during the terror? Was Robespierre a monster, or a man trapped by his own impossible ideals? By the mid-19th century, historians had begun to peel back the blood-soaked curtain. They found contradictions. This was the man who had fought for universal male suffrage, who had argued at first that no government should wield the power of death, who had defended the poor in court when no one else would. But this was also the man who signed lists of names by the dozen, who said terror is justice, who stood semennate while friends were beheaded. The contradictions didn't cancel each other out. They made him more terrifying, because Robespierre wasn't inhuman. He was, in fact, too human. A man so consumed by the idea of virtue that he became blind to suffering. A man who believed in justice so deeply that he didn't see when it turned to cruelty. A man who refused to compromise, even when compromise meant saving lives. That refusal became his legacy. Throughout the 20th century, Political movements across Europe looked at Robespierre through fractured glass. To revolutionaries, he was a symbol of purity, a man who dared to push the revolution to its fullest, who wouldn't bend to moderates, who died for his ideals. To critics of totalitarianism, he was a cautionary tale, a prototype of ideological extremism, a man who showed how quickly democracy can bleed into dictatorship when fueled by moral certainty. Writers like Albert Camus and Hannah Arendt saw him not as a relic of France but as a prophecy of the future, that when you mix idealism with fear and strap morality to violence, you do not get progress. You get a machine that feeds on its creators. Robespierre became more than a man. He became a symbol. In classrooms, he was debated. In books, he was dissected. In political theory, he was resurrected again and again, praised, condemned, misunderstood, invoked. Statues were never built, but pages filled with his name. Documentaries replayed the grainy facts. Novels reimagined his final hours. Plays gave him new monologues, torn between pride and despair. Yet no interpretation could fully contain him, because Robespierre didn't belong to just one era. He belonged to the moment when revolution turns on itself, when ideals become rigid, when purity is used as a blade. Even in the digital age, he reappears in discussions of justice, extremism, cancel culture, authoritarianism. He is a ghost haunting every movement that says, "We are right, and therefore we must destroy those who are wrong." His legacy is not about France. It's about the cost of believing you're the only one who sees clearly. And for all the words written about him, one truth remains undeniable. He did not save the people. He did not protect freedom. He did not build peace. He built fear. He built silence. He built a republic where disagreement meant death. And then he died by the very silence he created. When Robespierre died, the blade didn't just end a life, it severed a chapter of France, but echoes don't fade so easily. The next day, the guillotine still stood. The blood hadn't dried. The crowd still gathered, out of habit, out of fear, out of morbid awe. But something had broken. The very revolution Robespierre claimed to protect began to unravel. The Thermidorian reaction, the movement that overthrew him, quickly dismantled the structures he had built. The Committee of Public Safety was stripped of power. The Jacobin Club was shut down. Survivors of the terror turned on each other, grasping for distance, erasing their own complicity. No one wanted to admit they had stood silently while neighbours vanished. Robespierre became the perfect scapegoat. Blame him, they said. He was the tyrant. He was the executioner. He was the madman who hijacked a noble cause. And perhaps he was, but the truth was harder, colder, and far more frightening. He didn't rise alone. He rose on the shoulders of a crowd. He was cheered into power by citizens who thought fear could bring justice. He was enabled by men who were too afraid to speak or too eager to survive. His fall exposed the uncomfortable reality that the terror had not been imposed. It had been allowed. The revolution limped forward, fractured and exhausted. 2 years later, Napoleon Bonaparte would rise, not as a liberator, but as a stabilizer. France, tired of chaos, accepted an emperor. All those sacrifices, all that blood, and it ended with another crown. Robespierre's collapse wasn't just political, it was philosophical. He had believed that virtue and terror could coexist, that morality could be enforced by the state, that if you killed enough of the wicked, the good would inherit the earth. But terror doesn't build virtue, it builds trauma. In the aftermath, France saw not a purified republic, but widows, orphans, and graves. And still, the questions never stopped. Was Robespierre a villain, or the inevitable product of revolutionary fire? Was he sincere, or drunk on power? Did he lose control, or did he never have it to begin with? In the decades that followed, every regime in France would wrestle with his ghost. Republicans wanted to claim his idealism. Monarchists wanted to claim his downfall. Radicals wanted to claim his sacrifice, but no one wanted to claim the blade. The guillotine, once cheered as a symbol of justice, now haunted the national conscience. By the early 20th century, public executions had become shameful. By 1981, the death penalty was abolished in France altogether. Robespierre would have been furious, or perhaps finally at peace, because the truth is, even in death he changed France. Not by what he built, but by what he destroyed. And in that destruction he left behind a blueprint, not of revolution, but of warning. Maximilien Robespierre died as he had lived, certain he was right, certain he was good, certain that those who opposed him were enemies of the people, enemies of truth, enemies of justice itself, but certainty in his hands became a blade sharper than the guillotine, and when the blood finally dried, what remained was not a republic of virtue, but a field of graves. He began as a lawyer who defended the poor. He ended as a man who silenced an entire nation. He said terror was temporary. He said it was a path to peace. But terror always leaves a residue. It stays in the bones of survivors. It passes down through whispers, through trauma, through silence at dinner tables generations later. And Robespierre's silence, his inability to hear disagreement, to imagine being wrong, is what truly killed him. Because tyranny doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it wears a halo. Sometimes it wears plain clothes and speaks softly of justice. Sometimes it writes poetry, quotes Rousseau, and weeps for the poor while signing death warrants behind closed doors. Robespierre did not steal the revolution. He was the revolution, and that is what makes him terrifying. Because he reminds us that idealism left unchecked can become cruelty, that those who claim to purify the world may poison it instead. And perhaps worst of all, he reminds us that monsters don't always look like monsters. They look like men who never smile, who never joke, who say I don't want power while accumulating all of it. After his death, no monument was ever built in his honour. And yet, he remains one of the most studied figures of the French Revolution, not because of what he achieved, but because of what he exposed. He showed us how fragile democracy can be when fear is louder than reason. He showed us that the people is not a shield, it's a weapon, and anyone can claim to wield it. He showed us how quickly law can become execution, how fast morality can be weaponized, how easy it is to believe you're saving the world while you're slowly destroying it. And so we return to the question we began with. Was Robespierre a monster? Or was he a mirror? Because if we only remember him as a villain, we're safe. We can pretend he was rare. We can convince ourselves we'd never follow someone like him. But if he was a mirror, reflecting back the hunger for certainty, for moral clarity, for purity at all costs, then the real terror isn't what he did. The real terror is how easily we might do it too. So the question remains, what do we do? When someone speaks softly, dresses modestly, quotes justice and demands silence, do we cheer, do we look away, or do we remember that the blade doesn't care why it falls, only that it's sharp and that someone like Robespierre is always ready to pull the lever? I don't believe Robespierre was evil, but he proved that when a man believes he holds absolute truth, he can become more ruthless than the tyranny he once fought. It wasn't hatred that killed, it was blind faith in virtue, and that is what makes him truly terrifying.